Good afternoon. Now it got all serious all of a sudden. This is a remarkable turnout. And Michael Prevost just walked in too. Everybody wave to Michael Prevost, City Councillor. This is our final public presentation by our favorite Northwest Elder in residence. He's our first, so you're obviously going to be the favorite. Mel Bevan. The purpose of this series is to recognize different ways of knowing and to share that here at the university. And how we've tried to embody this is by having people such as Mel and others elder in residence. I think Mel's brother-in-law, Bob Dempsey.
Dempsey Bob.
I'm at a university, we always do last names. No, I'm just kidding. Dempsey Bob, who is also an elder in residence at Prince George. But this is the first time we've ever had the program here. And by your turnout and by the level of enthusiasm and feedback we received, it's something we're hoping to continue in the future. Today's presentation is on First Nations governance over 50 years. And Mel, I'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. And trying to, first of all, I just want to say that this is the last time, so it's been a real pleasure putting these things together and talking to you for the last three sessions and this one too. It's, for me, it's sort of like having an assignment to do once a week. And I don't know if Bruce is going to give me any marks for it. But in trying to come up with something in the last 50 years, there's so much to it. It's really hard to pick out some of the important stuff that's actually meaningful and that will give you give you a small idea of what it's like living under the Indian Act. Now I called it 50 years being ruled by the Indian Act, because that's the word ruled is what it really is. We're not governed under the Indian Act, we're ruled. And I'll go through that and explain what that basically means. Now just as an overview, in the last 50 years, I've been in this business for well over 50 years, probably closer to 60 years, and the Indian Act hasn't changed at all, barely, except for a few minor changes. It's still the same Indian Act we started with. So the changes that have been made have not been made by law. The act administered today is the same one I started with. Now, with the very first clause in the act, it's not a very big act, and if anyone's interested in it at all, I'd suggest you read it to see to see just how horrible it is. Most people just get mad and throw it away, and our own people do the same thing. We tell them to read it, and they just get mad. Because they don't realize just how bad it is. Now, the first clause in the act, this is clause 1. It says, this act shall be administered by the minister, who shall be superintendent general of Indian affairs. Now, the word superintendent general means that there are 10 superintendents, one for each province, and then the minister is the boss of all of them. Now, this clause gives the minister full power and authority to make any policy, whether it's recommended by bureaucrats or whether they dream it up or somebody dreams it up. But one thing you must know, it never comes from the native people, it always comes from the bureaucracy. Changes don't come because we demand them. Changes come because it makes them uncomfortable. Right? If we didn't makes them uncomfortable, there'd never be any changes. Now, every province has a regional director. One in Vancouver, there's one in Edmonton, there's one in Winnipeg, one in Regina, and one in Toronto, and so on. And each one of these has the same powers as a deputy minister. So they answer directly to the minister. And they also have the powers over us. This is what I mean when I say we're ruled by them, not governed by them. They tell us what to do, not, right? That's the way the Indian Act is set up. Now, we worked on a project maybe 10, 15 years ago. It's the Northwest Tribal Treaty. And we were trying to figure out, because what we were doing was we were responding to the government's proposal for a self-government act, which was so bad nobody wanted it. But I worked with a lawyer named Albert Peeling. I don't know if anybody's heard of him, because he's one of the probably the best lawyers that I've ever run across for understanding this stuff. And he was actually a clerk on the Supreme Court of Canada, and he was the one who wrote the Delgamuch decision. So he really understands a lot of this stuff. And we came up with the term rule by policy. And most of you know about the rule of law, and what means everybody lives under laws. Everything you do is governed by laws made by somebody. Even the ones who make laws are subject to those laws. That's what the rule of law means. And we threw that around. We talked about the rule by law. Rule by law is different. It means that the people who are making the laws are not bound by the laws they make. Now, it's the same with policy. Rule by policy. The policy that is made by the Department of Indian Affairs only applies to us, not to anybody else. That's why we came up with the term of rule by policy. Now, one interesting thing that most people aren't aware of is the Act makes no mention of band management or any other method of managing band affairs. There's nothing in the Act about band officers or anything. When the Act was written, there were no band officers, and it has stayed that way. An example, I found one example that might be easy to understand. Clause 34. It says, a band shall ensure that the roads, bridges, ditches, fences within the reserve occupied by that band are maintained in accordance with instructions issued from time to time by the superintendent. Now, that's about the only thing it talks about. We got to maintain the roads. It doesn't say how, but you got to do it if we tell you to. That's what that clause says. It's still, this is the Act today. It's not the Act 100 years. It was in there 100 years ago, but it's still there. It's still, that is still what it is. Right? So the Act, there's nothing in the Act that talks about how establishes band officers or management, which is completely different from, say, Municipal Act, where municipalities are set up to govern. They have all the rules set out in the Municipal Act. And bands have absolutely nothing. Now, band administration today exists because a minister, one of the ministers back in the 60s, and cabinet decided it would be a good idea. So the management that when you go to the band office, those officers are not set up by law. They're simply band Indian Affairs policy. That's all it is. It's just policy. Now, the minister's policies, bands under the Indian Act have no authority to manage or deliver government programs. there's all sorts of court cases. Anybody's interested in looking up some of these court cases. And one of the most recent one was a case called Louis versus Louis, where a band received a settlement of X number of dollars, and the band council decided to pay themselves retroactively for a year. And so the band members took them to court, and the council claimed that they had the authority to make that decision, to pay themselves out of monies that they negotiated. Now the court said, no, you don't. The only powers you've got are what's written in the Act. You do not have any powers to make any of those decisions. So the powers, the councils really have almost no powers. Right? And that, there's case law after case law that council decisions are overturned because of...
Mel, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, but the bands currently, if I understand, are the current providers of many services on reserve.
They are. No, I'll get to it.
Sorry, I'm always...
He does it every time.
I'm sorry. I mean,
Now, all the band office activity is carried out by funding agreements. That answers your question. Or contract. There's no law that says you got to deliver education. There's no law that says you got to provide health care. No law that says any of those things. It's all done by contract and agreements. So they're transfer of programs. They're not transfers of authority. They're simply transfers of delivery. Now, one of the peculiar things that happens on the bands is policy cannot be enforced by law. You cannot say you've broken a policy, therefore you have committed a crime. There's no such thing. Because policy, it can only be enforced by administrative action. Now, Canada, the way Canada enforces their policy, right, is to cut off the band's funding. If the council misspends or fails to deliver the programs properly, they simply stop sending you cancel all the contracts, don't send, no, and that's them, punish everybody. Or there's a process called third-party management, where the Department of Indian Affairs moves in, takes over the band, they take over all the powers, they take over all the management, and for as long as they like. You can't get out of it. You can't get out from under it. In the province, there is a similar method to where if the city council, it's happened a few times in British Columbia where the city council just simply refuses to do what they're told by the provincial government, and the government just fires them all and takes it over. And that has actually happened.
Never happened in Terrace, has it?
I don't know. Barry, has it ever happened here?
Not that I know of. Probably should.
No, over the years, changes have been made by policy. There have been changes. The Act has remained the same, but the policies keep changing. Remember the very first clause where the minister has all the power to do whatever he wants. And so as the years go by, most of the policy changes they make is to save them money. Because when I first started 50 years ago, Indian Affairs was still doing everything. They were providing the welfare, they were providing education, they were providing, jobs, they did everything. And they had an office in Terrace, where the post office, the old post office building, that used to be the Indian Affairs office. And they used to provide everything. Bands didn't control their money, they didn't control anything, we just existed. And over the years, they started creating these band administrations by policy. And as a result, the band Indian Affairs offices got smaller and smaller because they didn't need as many people. Because there was probably about 20 people working in the Indian Affairs office in Terrace. It was quite full. And there was one in Prince Rupert, one in Hazelton. I think there was one in Smithers, Burns Lake, Prince George. They were all over the place. And they gradually shut down over the years, and each time they shut them down, they transferred more programs to bands. They've also created, by policy, a lot of delivery organizations, such as health boards. You've heard of Native health boards, education boards, there's economic development boards, there's housing societies. You know, and keep in mind that these are all done by policy. And we're pretty much at the mercy of the department and the government of Canada. Because remember, when I was president of Kermode Friendship Centre quite a few years ago, and with myself, Ray Jones, and Danny Sheraton, who was on city council at the time, started the Moxkamal Housing Society for Native people. So and that was funded by CMHC and others. So we were able to build probably about 150 homes, that's including apartment buildings. So we had a lot of homes in Terrace that we built under that organization. And that ran for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And you know, we were just getting to the point where we were having all these mortgages paid off, and we were beginning to have enough money to start building more houses out of the because we can mortgage the homes that we right. And they don't like it when you do that, so they took it over. It now belongs to the BC Housing. It's no longer a Native organization. The same thing happened. We also started the Lochgels Law Centre. I don't know if anybody remembers that, where we had a Native Law Society running out office in Terrace. The purpose of that society was, I was president for, because I formed it, and I was also president of that. And we formed it to make certain that Native people had legal services when they needed it, and as an education tool. And that went for for a long time. We had Terry Brown was our head lawyer there, and that lasted. And then again, that we fell out of favor with the politicians of the time, and so they took that back. And now there is no more law center, because they are done by policy. They can simply cancel them at their pleasures. That's the only way I can say it. So if we don't behave ourselves and be nice all the time, they start doing these things to us. They have ways of right? And I know it sounds harsh, but that's the fact. That's what it is. You know, I hear a lot of people say, well, all you got to do is this, all you got to do is that. You know, if we were able to do those easy things, we would have done it 100 years ago. You know, it isn't just a matter of, well, it's just, who was it? Martin Luther. I was reading one of Martin Luther King's writings, and one of the things he says, it's a cruel jest to tell a bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps. You know, so if you have no boots, how can you pull yourself up? And since the rule by policy cannot create organizations, right? Remember now, it's policy. It can't create organizations. Bands also can't create organizations. Bands have no legal entity. They are not persons under the law. So they cannot form organizations. They can't own land. They can't own companies. They cannot own non-profit societies. They can't own education boards. They can't own health boards. They can't own anything legally. So all of the organizations are created under the Provincial Non-Profit Societies Act. Every time we start something, we have to form a new society under the Societies Act. And that's who we report to. Like the Housing Society, we had to report to the province. The Law Centre, we had to report to the province. All the Native organizations in British Columbia, whether they're tribal councils or whatever, have to report to the Societies Act, to the province of British Columbia. There's no requirement or not even a method of reporting to the people. So these organizations, they get started with a good purpose. Eventually they run out of purpose and begin to wander off and do their own thing because they're just take on a life of their own. That happens quite often. And the purpose, and again, the purpose of all of these boards and societies is to carry out government policy under contract. That's what they do. They're not, and they're not governed. They don't govern. They're simply carrying out government policy. And back to rule by policy. That isn't to say there is no progress. The progress some nations have experienced over the years is not due to the policies of Canada, but again, I'm stealing this location. You take a band like Osoyoos in the Okanagan, they're doing great. You try to do that up here, that you can't grow grapes, right? Right? You can't build a golf course, right? There's already one here. All of the things that they're doing down there cannot be done up here or anywhere else because they just happen to have a good location. The same is true of West Bank. It's right next to Kelowna. They can take advantage of all of the economic development, all the things that happen. They can do those things. Right? It really has nothing to do with Canada. And again, in Prince Rupert, there's Metlakatla Band, who's right in Prince Rupert. There's a lot of things they can do. They own Metlakatla owns about, the last count was about 13 companies. They're involved in tourism, stores. They own all the ferry systems. They own the ferry system that runs around Prince Rupert. That's because of their location, not because of any other reason. So there are a lot of really successful bands in Canada, but because all of us, we live in Canada, right? No matter where you are. We progress along with everybody else at pretty much the same rate. We do just about everything else that everybody does. We can build companies, we run businesses, do whatever. But it all depends on location. Now their success, a community, it's because again, the Act does not, is probably one of the worst methods of ruling that you can dream up. If you're told to dream up the worst possible method of governance you can, you'd end up with an Indian Act. Good project for university students. See how bad you can make a law.
Wait a minute.
Now, it is possible for communities. I've worked for some, worked for a few, and worked with a bunch. If you have a council that's prepared to work towards improving the lives, and that's working together with a real goal of improving things, can be done, as long as you have a talented staff willing to help the council and willing to carry out the work of community improvement. Those two together can do amazing things. But as again, it was actually my daughter who coined the term personality driven, because these all depend on the personality of the people involved. If you've got a council, a chief councillor who has a real strong personality and ready to actually to do good things, and you also have a management staff, that are prepared to stick their necks out every once in a while, because you do have to stick your neck out to get anything done. And it actually works. The problem is, Herb, George, and I was at a meeting in Ottawa, when was it, 2 weeks ago? Yeah. And one of the things that we talked about is how does the Indian Act actually work? And one of the problems with the Indian Act is no matter how good you get a council and a staff working together, eventually the Indian Act will correct itself. It simply goes back to what it was before. And I've seen that happen so many times, where a community is progressing, things are happening, people are working, there's all kinds of things happening. And when you get a change in council, the whole thing just simply goes back to what it was before, because the Indian Act always corrects itself. Now, for the people living on the reservations, very little has changed in the past 50 years. The things have actually gotten worse for a lot of the commute people. I remember when I was a 8 years old or something. I still remember those. There was hardly anybody living in Terrace. Terrace had a population of 300 people. So this land was still empty. We were still able to use the land the way we always have. But after the war, we started losing land, became more and more settled, and things, game started to get scarce, fish started to get, even this year we didn't even get any. So a lot of the things that we had have disappeared. And the land base also disappeared. So things have actually, but the only the method of interacting with Canada and the provinces has changed. And that's all changed by policy. It is the people within the delivery system created by policy who have benefit from the change. Now, it sounds kind of harsh, but that's the truth. That is the truth. The people barely benefit from some of the major progress, but the staff and all the major organizations across Canada, Native organizations, they all have it great, but the people still see very little change. And I'm trying to leave you some time. Now I'm going to get into because we are talking about governance, right? Because one thing about, if we don't talk about treaties or something very different, we're going to still be under the Indian Act, and nothing will change. The government of Canada really has no desire to change the Indian Act. They've tried a number of times over the years, and it's been total failure, because they all do the same thing. They try to tinker with it. You can't tinker with a...
I can't think of the metaphor. One of our college students? Can't fish
What-
it,
yeah,
can't
what-
fish.
Was it DeSoto? He'd remember what a DeSoto was. or an Edsel. You can't tinker with something that's no good to begin with. No. So in order to get out of that, we need to negotiate something completely different. And that's that is one of the reasons for negotiating a treaty. But that wasn't always the case. There are a number of different types of treaties that in Canada. The first were what are known as the pre-Confederation treaties. That was treaties made with nations before Canada was Canada. And they were mainly peace treaties. The nations became allies. Native nations remained independent, and they stayed self-governing, and their homelands were largely unaffected. These were just treaties to say that we're not going to fight each other anymore, but if we start fighting with the guys across the border, you guys will help us out. And that's what actually happened in the War of 1812, right? And so those treaties were understandings with one another that there'd be no more wars between Canada and the settlers, the native people and the settlers. And those were what were called the pre-Confederation treaties. They're still there. Most of them are in Quebec and southern Ontario. With the Huron, the Mohawk are an example of these old treaties. Now, after Confederation and the Indian Act, the numbered treaties, those are they're called, we call them, they're called the numbered treaties. They're Treaty 1, Treaty 2, Treaty 3, Treaty 8 is in northern British, part of it is in northern British Columbia. And these were negotiated to surrender land to the Crown, except for a parcel of land as a reservation. So a lot of these numbered treaties, they weren't negotiated the way the modern day treaties are now. They were simply, we will give up huge chunks of our land in exchange. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at some of these old treaties where in exchange for the land they'd get rifles and bullets and medicine box and $5 a piece and stuff like this every year. What they still do that actually. Now, and the number of treaties are still governed under the Indian Act. They still are. Some of these are fairly large. Like, for example, the Blood tribe in Alberta, their reservation is about 550 square miles, compared to Kitselas, who has 1 square mile. Right. So there's a huge difference. Some of them are very large. And I remember talking to somebody from New Brunswick, complaining about how small their reserve was. She says it's only 400 square miles, compared to some of the ones in BC. They are fairly. They were negotiated. Right? No, Indian Act governs in areas of Canada such as British Columbia, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Northern Quebec. No treaties were negotiated, but reservations were created by Canada as if there were treaties, and the bands are governed under the Indian Act, the same as the numbered treaties. Right? So in Canada, bypassed in this area, especially BC, Canada bypassed the requirement to negotiate treaties and simply turned all of the lands owned by native people into crown lands and set aside reserves where there were. I called them, the reserves became pockets of Indian land and were separate from the rest of Canada. They're still separate. We're not part of Indian reserves are not in reality, in fact, not part of Canada. Doesn't say that anywhere, but that's the effect. We're not part of Canada. For example, Indian reserves do not receive any services from the province. The highways doesn't plow the roads. The school boards don't have no jurisdiction on reserves. Health care, BC health care does not apply on reserves. That's all provided by Canada. So none of the services that are provided to you in TERS applies on the reserve. So we're not actually, you can say we're not part of Canada. There was a time when we weren't allowed to leave the reserve, but that in the 50s, I think it was 1951, that part got repealed. Now, modern day treaties. These are the newer ones. They're actually negotiations into Canada. That's what these modern day treaties, they're not surrender treaties anymore. Like the old treaties where we'll give up our land, you give us a reserve, and we'll live under the Indian Act. The modern day treaties don't do that. The first modern day treaty was the Cree Nation in northern Quebec. Now, in their treaty, it was negotiated, I think, a guy by the name of Billy Diamond, who negotiated this entire package. It came in two parts. One was a land claims agreement document, and the other was a governance agreement. So there were two separate things. And I'll explain what the difference is later on the next one here. The Yukon Agreement, again, that came next, and that has three parts. There's three parts to it. One is an umbrella agreement, which kind of lays the principles that on lawmaking authority and all that, all that stuff. And then each community had what was called an individual agreement, which came under the umbrella agreement. And then the third part of the agreement was a self-government agreement. Now, a treaty, in effect, becomes part of the Canadian Constitution under Section 35 and cannot be touched by Parliament. Now, when you hear people say that the treaty is protected by the Constitution, what it really means is that I use the term, it's out of reach of Parliament. They can't reach up and change it, right? So that's really because what it actually says in the treaty is that this agreement is a land claims agreement within the meaning of Section 35, which puts it into the Constitution. And the Section 35 simply says that Canada recognizes existing Aboriginal rights. Once it's an agreement, it becomes an existing right, and that's why it becomes protected. Except self-government agreements are not protected. Now, West Bank has a self-government agreement, the Yukon have a self-government agreement, the Cree have they're not protected by the Constitution, right? So they can be changed. Now, it's still kind of halfway between the old treaties and the Nisga'a Treaty. The Nisga'a Treaty actually broke a lot of ground. The Nisga'a team was the first to successfully negotiate self-government as part of the land claims settlement, which means their self-government is actually in the Constitution. It's no longer separate, and it cannot be touched by Parliament. And by including governance in their treaty, the Nisga'a, in effect, they actually, in effect, whether they plan to or not, that this is what actually happened. They created a third order of government, which never existed before. Now, Gordon, and the provision was challenged by Gordon Campbell. You remember him? He was the premier. You don't want to remember him. Now, Gordon Campbell and Jeff Plant took this to court, took the Nisga'a to court on their self-government, claiming that all of the governance powers were distributed between Canada and the province. There was no room. There was no room for Native people in the Canadian Constitution. But the court ruled they were wrong. There was room, lots of room, actually. So because of the Nisga'a Agreement, the case law, the Supreme Court has ruled that Native people can govern, taking some authority from the province, some from Canada, and a bunch of authorities that they have themselves. So the Nisga'a Treaty was a major breakthrough. Now all of the modern day treaties now have constitutionally protected self-government, and that from friendship treaties to surrender treaties to the Indian Act and the various the other deal. I think I've got the other claims agreement was the Nunavut one in the Northwest Territories. They didn't actually have a land claim settled, but they're still a territory, but a separate territory governed by them. And the reason it's governed by them is because they hold 85% of the population in the entire North, so they're able to do that. And I promised my daughter I'd give her 15 minutes.
You shortchanged her by one now.
So thank you for listening, and I hope you're.
As we're switching mics, I wanted to ask, I forgot before, we're hoping to take a few pictures today. Does anybody object if we take your picture? You can put your hands up. Well, a couple of, and at the end we were hoping to have a group picture with Mel, okay? And Sharon Oski is our photographer today.
Hello, my name is Sue Bevan, Mel's daughter. I often I remember the day like when I was sitting there and I kind of went, what the heck? Like, how did my dad pass on this to me, right? Like, how did this end up on my plate? And the funny thing is that I see my own daughters getting passionate about this. They're 22 and 18, and they're starting to get passionate as well. But I still don't know how I did that, right? And this is important. This is important to remember, though. I don't know how he did it, and I don't know how I did it. I was asked because I'm a current council member, but this is my first term. I've never wanted to run for council, but I did this year and managed to squeak in. So it's my first term. I haven't even gotten to a year yet. However, I've worked with the community since I was 19 years old, and I was trying to figure out, well, what does that work out to? And it's like 30 some odd years. So I have some experience in this. With my dad, I say we're two sides of the coin. We used to argue all the time. And then one day I realized we're arguing the same thing. He's just seeing it from one side of the coin, and I'm seeing it from the other side of the coin. I think my dad knew that. It took me a while to figure that out, but my dad just likes to argue, so. It's interesting. I liked what he said about the Indian Act corrects itself. And for those of you who are learning about systems theory, what a great project. I'd love to see the results. So, systems theory, the system is always going to go back into a state of balance. And I think when I hear it like that, I think our resistance to that is what keeps it going into entropy, right? So we continue to resist, and we continue to ensure that something is shaking up that system. My background has been mostly in social programs. I've done education, the social development program, and majority of it being health. So this is the perspective that I take away is the people side. My dad talked about rule by policy. You know, a good administrator is one who's always trying to figure out how to get around policy, right? Not implement policy, but to get around policy. And the trick to that has always been what is necessary to keep the fund going, and what can we do to get around those restrictions. I think one of the saddest parts of living under the Indian Act is being led to believe that this is normal, that this is the right way to do it, and to have our own people enforcing policy. You know, that's a sad reality of 50 years. It's not this is the right thing to do. But when they're shown that this is systemic, that this is that it's all part of the problem, then they also get that resistance, wanting to make something different, seeing that it is systemic. It's also a very hard thing to do, okay? I use the right hand, for those of you who are right-handed, it's dominant, right? It's a dominant hand. This is the government in my mind. It's the right hand, not because it's right, because it's dominant. It's very easy as an administrator to just simply deliver the programs, follow the policies, do the paperwork. That is easy work, right? You got all your little forms that they give you, or you develop the forms that they tell you to develop and the way they want it developed. That is the easy part. It's so easy to do that. The people is the left hand, right? Very necessary, right? Very creative, very everything, but it's very easy to ignore. Because you get caught over here doing the paperwork. You get caught over here making sure that the policy's followed. You get caught over here doing all this, and you forget that this hand is the one to your heart. This hand is the one that a good administrator works with all the time. You have to keep it in your head all the time, because it's too easy to forget. It's also a lot more difficult to do, because the systems, they don't match, right? If they matched, it would be a hand-in-hand thing and life would be great, but they don't. They're not the same. They don't work well together. You have to do both, and it's a completely different system to be working in. One of my favorite ways of explaining that is in the health department, we decided to do well, we didn't decide. We were told to do a health plan, and part of that health plan was to come up with a mission statement, right? Everybody who's worked for an organization knows you have to come up with a mission and philosophy statement. So I started with a group of elders. We had a lot then. We don't have many now, at least because I'm moving up there, right? We don't consider ourselves elders yet. But we had a group, and there was a lot of us, like at least half this room. And I sat down with them, and I said, they helped me on so many things, getting things started. Where if at any time they said, you need to do this. I started with the elders. So we started there, and I said, we need to do a mission statement. Explained to them what a mission statement was. We asked a few questions. What is health? Or, you know, what is the role of community? What is blah, blah, blah? And so we came up with an idea. So the next meeting, it was a smaller group. But you got to understand that the smaller group was not because people quit being interested. The elders kind of informally said, no, these people can take over, right? And so we narrowed it down a little bit more. And then the next meeting was down to 4 people, because they had decided amongst themselves that these people can take care of this. And so we worked with this small group, and we went through what is health and it was interesting at this time because I had a group of elders who think in their language. That's a very, I don't know if you understand that, but they think in their home language, the language of their homeland. And so me speaking in English, not just with the jargon, which is a whole nother story, that's a funny one too. I had to have somebody in between the ages as the interpreter through English. No Similgit was spoken at this point. They were just trying to take the very colonized ideas that I had, translated into English into a way that the elders would understand. So you see how complicated that left hand can be, right? Anyways, we came up with what they wanted to say, and then I said, well, okay, the ideas. They came up with the ideas of what, and I said, okay, well, so I wrote it out. Nope. I wrote it out. Nope. I wrote it out. Nope. And then they finally said, it can't be said in English. We cannot say it in English. There's no way you are going to be able to translate this. So then we brought it to council and we said, okay, we have a problem here. Can we write it in our own language? And they said, oh yeah, go for it. So we wrote it out in our own language. I cannot say it. And then we provided a description. We just provided a description of what that statement meant. So we cannot look at the statement, we have to look at the description. So even if you took the sentence that they wrote and translated it, you're going to lose what it means. You have to know what it means. You have to look at the description of what that means. From there, this left hand has to implement this policy through that lens, right? And that takes a lot of energy because it's so easy to go back to here. It's so easy to go back into the paperwork. It's so easy to go into there. And because they require a lot of reporting, right? And so, but to keep that implemented has been a challenge. And a lot of it is, sadly, because of who's running it, right? If you have somebody who's willing to constantly work on the left side, you're going to have a good administrator, you're going to have a good worker, you're going to have, because they're the ones that are reaching out to the people. And even at council, so I've experienced flipping back and forth my entire life, right? Because even at council, I find that we get stuck over here when we need to go over here. And it's because those two systems don't meet well. They don't meet well. They don't come together well. My dad has a better understanding of why. I just know they don't, right? I think then the next part of that is to try and, because it's not acceptable to say, this is what it should be. This is not what it should be. So the next part of that for us is building the capacity, right? Building the capacity of our own people, continually building that capacity. But just like I talked about administrators, we have to look at our young people growing up and say, yes, you need skills and knowledge from these schools, from these universities, but you need to know how to work the left hand, right? You need to know how to do that. And in my mind, the only way of doing that, and I don't have a huge solution, is to do partnerships with the universities, with organizations in terrace, and not just economic partnerships, but social partnerships, health partnerships, because those are the things where we're going to be able to say, okay, we need some of this, and you need to listen to us here, and we need to build that in. We need to build that in. I was lucky. I was incredibly lucky at the time that I started off in university, and I recognize how lucky I am. We had a program through University of Victoria, and it was Northwest Band Social Workers Association had recognized that they couldn't do anything in child welfare. Children were being apprehended, and they could do nothing because they didn't have a degree. And so they decided to run a degree program, and they partnered with University of Victoria.
Where?
University of Victoria in
here.
Terrace. Yeah. I don't think UNBC existed at that time, to tell you the truth. And all the education happened in the north. All the students were working for their communities. They already had a passion. Because it was being run through Northwest Band Social Workers Association, we were able to hire professors from across Canada, First Nations professors from across Canada. And the students, I was one of, I think I might have been the youngest at the time, because we had people like Helen Clifton. She's just a mass of knowledge of culture, and Daphne Robinson, and we had the students in the class were powerful in their own right. And so from there, we were able to, our education came together. We were able to balance these. We were able to do this, and as a result, we have a lot of students out there well, I'm the youngest, right? So who have been able to do like these child welfare agencies. Where do you think those came from, right? From that class. Those people have pushed that agenda along. So we need to form those partnerships that can build the skills and knowledge, but the partnership allows us to make sure that our students are grounded in their culture. And it's 1 o'clock, and I'm just thinking if there's anything really that I wanted to talk about. Oh, the students, if there's students here and wanted to get more information on the treaties or the Indian Act, I would suggest that you look at the website, the Center for First Nations Governance. My dad was part of setting up that organization. And I think that's all. We got past 1 o'clock, but anything you want to add?
This has been a real privilege in order to be able to host this here at UNBC. Sue and Mel will linger to answer your questions, because I'm sure there are more questions than we have time, and I'm conscious of our commitments. I want to take the opportunity to thank the people who made this possible, and that would include people such as Alex and Caitlin over here, who live stream all the events, Alma, who orders all the food and doubled it up today on the fly. Who else is? Sharon, who's our photographer person. Our faculty, our staff, our students, And thank you to the cooperating organizations. We have had a number here: City Council, Skeena Diversity, and Northwest Community College. This was different. In Prince George, the elder would be there for a week and students would stop in or things of that nature. We reasoned here that maybe we don't have enough students to have a drop-in model, but if we included our partners in education, such as the college and Skeena Diversity and City Council, that we could indeed create a sufficient demand for this particular service. And I'm pretty sure that I can say that we have had more people attend the Elder in Residence program here than have attended many in Prince George. So, borrowing from the metaphor of our dear presenter, it's so wonderful that we can take the concepts and principles of the university and the academy and the college and combine them with the concepts and knowledge and culture of First Nations communities, and let's bring them together in a round of applause for our presenters and our elder in residence. Now I got a presentation for you. Sharon will undoubtedly want to take it. You can come here. We want to express our appreciation. Mel attended, he gave 4 different sessions, public presentations. He met with classes, individuals, as well as attended our regional advisory committee. So we're hoping that you'll join us in getting a group photo when we try to put this on to Mel. Sharon, did you get it? Okay, thank you again.